All right, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we're live. Let's see what happens when I hit this intro. All right, everybody, can you hear me? I'm trying a whole new computer here, and due to my continuous video editing and stuff, the last computer just starts to slow down. And I'm hoping that I'm coming through crystal clear. You guys can hear me, see me. Let me know in the chat. Excellent, excellent. Someone says, yes, I can. Awesome. I hope everybody's doing well today. Good to see you in the chat, everybody. I want to talk about this topic, and I want to go ahead and give you up front my answer. I don't know, right? Like, I don't have any dog in the fight on absolutely how Islam began. But this is an important topic, and it's worth taking jabs at, and what kind of methodology we use when we bring that to this topic. So I want to get everybody to, everybody started tuning into the chat and actually jumping into the live stream before I dig in. And before I start specifying some importance to this whole subject matter and why I even want to talk about it and what the goal is and what I'm trying to aim at. So the first thing I want to do is give a plug here. We're going to plug. What are we doing here? This is not what I wanted to plug. I wanted to plug Stephen J. Shoemaker. And I'm going to give you a few academic books as we dive in. Some of the sources, I didn't list exhaustive, of course, in the chat, but Dr. Stephen J. Shoemaker has written a wonderful book on Mary and early Christian faith and devotion to understand the history behind certain developments in the character of Mary, right? Or creating the Quran is his latest, right? So there's been some controversy surrounding this work, which I haven't read yet, but I can't dive into something I don't know. There has been some stirred up controversy in the communities on Twitter and, of course, in the academic community and Islamic scholarship. I think dealing with this carbon dating of the Quran and how it came to be and stuff. So anyway, I'm speaking ignorantly on that. A prophet has appeared. I want to give you some sources before we dive into some stuff. The rise of Islam through Christian and Jewish eyes. You're going to see why this is significant as we dive into this. The other book that I really want to get into, well, The Apocalypse of Empire. Everybody who watches my channel knows, like, I like talking about the failed second coming of Jesus, that he predicted, or at least Paul for sure thought the end was going to happen near. Where did he learn this from? Who taught him? Was Jesus an apocalyptic prophet? And if so, did it fail, right? Well, this is the apocalypse within Islam and its origins. And we're going to get into the details here. I so badly want to do that, but I want to give everybody a chance. And this is the book we're going to dive into today, at least an introduction. I want everybody tuning in today to take this little journey with me, the death of a prophet, the end of Muhammad's life, and the beginning of Islam. And we're going to approach this in a unique way. So let me pop in here real quick, let you see my ugly mug as we dive into this subject matter. Thank you, everybody in the chat. I appreciate all you. I, of course, appreciate you, members of MythVision as well. Appreciate you coming in and showing some love. Someone says, we are mega handsome. Lost fan says, thanks for doing this work. Islam hasn't been analyzed enough, and we got to do better. There is no Islamic Bart Ehrman yet. Not Bart Ehrman on the critical side that Bart Ehrman does bring. I will say there are Islamic Bart Ehrmans, but they're not as outspoken, because I need to give you some political correctness a little. And there's nothing wrong with that. I know that that's used as a derogatory term, but like in America, this is so complicated. I don't want to get into politics, but I want to point out, when 9/11 happened, a stereotype really, really, really emerged. Anyone who wore hijab, anyone who was Muslim, was viewed in a way, often, okay, this was a big stereotype, not everyone, but a big stereotype went out against Muslims. Because are you going to be the one? Are you going to be the one to do this? Or can I trust you? And there is, in history, we've known this forever, that people who speak different languages or different cultures, different traditions, things like that, you're not trusting them as much as people of your own kind. And so there has been absolutely Islamophobia that has occurred, but also, do you really want to get your head cut off at the same time? So there's like the two-edged sword here. That's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I'm not saying, see, that's the hard part, right? Like there are extremists out there, but are most of them like that? These are the questions that get debated online and stuff like that. And so I definitely want to bring more light, bringing not the animosity, but the actual curious, intellectual, scholarly approach on investigating this topic using historical methodology, which I would say is a naturalist methodology. So if you're a person of faith, well, you can follow me on what I'm saying, and then at the end, draw your line and say, nope, this is what I believe, because I'm not willing to go there, because I think the angel Gabriel really did speak to Muhammad, and this was a message from Allah, or whatever, right? My goal is to get people to see, using this methodology, that there are alternative ways of thinking of this without necessarily being a fundamentalist. And I'm hoping that more people come out of the radical fundamentalist background. So thank you so much for that super chat. Really, really appreciate that. We're going to dive in here in just a second. Everybody's slow this morning. I don't know if they have their cup of coffee or if they got lost, but I sure hope that everybody tunes in and sees where I'm coming from with this. Box Fencer says, is there a guest? I am the host today. I am going to be discussing things that I think are extremely relevant to the topic. And I'm going to be discussing work of other academics in the field and why I think this is important. Box Fencer, no guest, I'm out. All right. Well, have a good day. We're going to dive into the death of a prophet, the end of Muhammad's life, and the beginning of Islam. Now, why is this important? Let me tune down my little jams in my head here. I'm going to explain to you why this is so important to entering this discussion. Okay. All right. Number one, if you ask a Christian, and I want to use Christianity because it's what I know so well. If you ask a Christian who Jesus was, right? They're going to tell you he's a son of God, most likely God in the flesh. They have a creedal statement. They come at it with that approach. They already believe Jesus is in some way this way. Now, you can get less consensus views about Jesus, but he's still divine, or he's extremely important, and he carries with him capabilities of being able to do miracles, you name it. And if you ask an academic within the field, like I do 24/7 on MythVision, who was Jesus? You're going to get different historical answers for who Jesus may have been. He may have been an apocalyptic prophet. He may have been this philosopher type. He may have been a stoic in a sense, right? He may have been a revolutionary zealot with a sword leading a band of bandits against Rome to defeat the empire that conquered the Jews and had control of Judea. There's so many different historical Jesuses that do float around. And there is also the model that he's a composite figure of historical people. There's also, he's a composite of various mythologies, and therefore he never even existed. There's all sorts of different things that float out there. But if we take historical Jesus studies and recognize, when did Christianity begin? A lot of scholars say when we're reading Paul, when we're reading the New Testament, we're not even looking at Christianity yet. We're looking at proto, what was some form of Jewish religion that then evolves into Christianity. And it's highly complicated. In the New Testament, we don't even see complete agreement on the doctrinal statements on what to believe, what we should do. Should you convert and circumcise and become more of a Torah observant Jewish type person in order to be saved by Christ? Paul thinks not. It's by faith, not of the law, right? So there's different modes of gospels that are floating around. And then we have what we call Christianity, right? This is my stick that I had against some of the apologists that came out in the past saying, turn off these channels. You first need to wrap your head around what Christianity is first. Then you can go watch these skeptics like MythVision and Apologia and you name it. And it's like, no, like what Christianity is up for grabs. Like, we aren't absolutely certain what Christianity really was. And if we were, there wouldn't be so many different types of Christianity right out the gate, from Docetism and Marcionites religion, you name it, like various forms of Christ-following groups that spawn from the earliest forms of what we would say is a Judeo religion. And we're going to say we know what Christianity is. That's anachronistic. That's once they have the canon, once they fix the doctrines over hundreds of years of debating the issues, and then they look back and go, oh, we got the right version of Christianity. I say all that to say, is that what's happening with the study of Islam? Is this what's happening with Muhammad's life? And if you look at Muhammad, who he was, right? If we try to historically analyze and investigate Muhammad, do we think that the followers of him made him into a theological prophetic figure? Just like, did Jesus really walk around floating and walking on water and healing all these people and doing all of these things as described in the Gospels? Or is this the fan fiction, so to speak, the theology that is built around this key figure that is the center, the head of their movement? And this is what many academics think is the case. What we see about Jesus isn't always what Jesus actually did, but rather what the followers of him portrayed him as. Anywho, I want to make this point because we're going to read an introduction to this book. I was reading it on the airplane headed to Israel, Palestine, to go and journey there and do a lot of recording, which I still have a ton of. And I said, man, this introduction is a perfect way to introduce it to the world and to let people realize why this is a good debate, why this is an important issue, and go from there. Real quick, I did see we had a super chat here. I want to make sure I show you some love, Lost Fan. Gotta challenge ideas, including Islam. It should be scrutinized like we've done with Christianity, text analysis, literature analysis, history comparison, etc. 100%. I'm with you. And I think that more and more people are starting to allow that and be open to this. The way we should approach this is, what are the facts? What does the data say, right? And I do think that we're getting there. Things are starting to look up, and we can actually look at it with historical methodology, openly discuss these ideas and stuff without it being a, measuring contest. I'm right, you're wrong. And if that's the approach and that's the debate that you're stuck in, I think all the academics I've talked to that I've brought this up to, they're like, that's not even fun to me. It's not even exciting. They're really wanting to get into the serious scholarship and stuff. Can it be used for that? Sure. But I think people double down on their beliefs when you confront them oftentimes, and it becomes my tradition's right and I have to believe this. So I want to try and introduce today why this is an actual academic, not like an online debate type thing. It can be made that, but why serious scholars who go to Harvard, who go to Yale, who go to Oxford, you name it, are actually talking about this, and why they're writing about this subject matter, because it is somewhat of a conspiracy, or at least a mystery, I'll say. The non-Muslim sources that are early in Islam are saying different things than what the Muslim sources that are biographies and such that come a couple centuries after the Quran's origins and such. Should we throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh no, because it's a few centuries, there's no historical data? No. Should we trust because it's earlier in non-Muslim sources, therefore it's true? Should we trust it? No, not necessarily, because it may be propaganda, they may be ill-informed, or they may be extremely slanted against the Muslims and not interested in actually knowing what was being said or done. And another issue that Robert Hoyland points out is these sources sometimes are taking place 800 to 1,000 miles away from Arabia, where these things happen. So how much good information do they have that far away? And there's a debate that goes on amongst Western scholars on what is and what isn't. So you're right, Lost Fan. We need to do this. I think we should do it in a way that is professional. And that's what I'm trying to do today. Welcome to the chat, everybody. I appreciate you tuning in. I've got 138 people tuned in right now. So why don't we just have some fun and dive into reading this introduction? I'm going to try a few things. Tell me if this, what I'm going to show you, is visible, if you could see the text, or if I should just be full screen reading this, because I want it to be aesthetically pleasing for people who are watching. So can you guys see that? That is the book. Can you see the font on the page? And should I read it with the font on the page here, or should I read it with you just looking at my ugly mug? Let me know. All right, Marks, give me a thumbs up. Let me know in the chat. Too small with comment sledge open. Okay. Well, then I'm going to go back to this. Here we go. So Daniel, you can see, but most people who are on a phone won't be able to. So I'm going to read and periodically pause to emphasize what's being said here. And I hope that this sparks your curiosity. Most people who watch my videos probably aren't reading all the material that I discuss. This introduction to this topic should get spicy. It should create curiosity. It should make you want to learn more about it. So let's start. Introduction, and this is to, let me scroll up here and make sure everybody's on the same page. The death of a prophet, the end of Muhammad's life, and beginnings of Islam. And if you hear any background noise, please forgive me because I am dealing with a new computer and I'm not sure how everything works here. The publication of Patricia Crone and Michael Cook's controversial study, Hagarism, in 1977, unquestionably marks a watershed in the study of religious culture and the early medieval Near East, even if its significance has occasionally been underestimated by other specialists in the field. In particular, this relatively slim volume highlighted the potential importance of non-Islamic literature for knowledge of religious and secular history in the 7th and 8th centuries, a so-called dark age for which sources are often sparse and spotty. Perhaps more importantly, however, this study proposed a radical new model for understanding both the formation of the Islamic tradition and the general religious landscape of the early medieval Near East. Together with the contemporary works of John Wansbrough, Hagarism articulated an innovative reinterpretation of formative Islam as a faith intimately intertwined with the religious traditions of Mediterranean late antiquity and in need of extensive study in the context of this religiously complex intercultural milieu. For example, Christianity. Christianity came from Mother Judaism, and Mother Judaism was wholly separate from the pagan world. Wrong, right? Like, we now know how Hellenistic thought influenced and permeated. I wish I could close down this background noise here. It's kind of bothering me. We now know that Christianity came out of a form of Judaism, but what was this? What was what we call Judaism before 70 AD, before Rabbinic Judaism came on the scene? And let me see if I can close out. This chat is getting on my nerves. Can you hear that chat in the background, by the way, that's popping up? Let me know. In the chat. So Christianity definitely comes out of a mix of pagan, or if you will, Mediterranean ideas that were not wholly Jewish, if that makes sense. And so we need to investigate Christianity with an open mind and broaden our sources and our understanding of how this thing began, rather than just looking at the Hebrew Bible and trying to go, well, this is written. And there's this direct connection between the Hebrew Bible and Christianity alone. There's a much bigger world out there. So, all right, continuing. There are, it must be admitted, some considerable and undeniable flaws in Hagarism's reinterpretation of formative Islam, as even its most sympathetic readers have often acknowledged. Most significantly, Hagarism has been rightly criticized for its occasional uncritical use of non-Islamic sources in reconstructing the origins of Islam. I think that's pretty straightforward. any non-Muslim sources kind of get a higher pedigree in evaluating Islam rather than kind of trying to find a balance between both Muslim and non-Muslim sources or Islamic, non-Islamic sources. And, they were kind of like saying, well, non-Muslim sources that date earlier are more accurate in every respect, in a sense. Waynesboro, I hope I'm saying it, Wansbro, I'm not sure how I'm pronouncing his name properly, but for instance, asks rather pointedly of Crone and Cook's reconstruction. Can a vocabulary of motives be freely extrapolated from a discrete collection of literary stereotypes composed by alien and mostly hostile observers? Can people who are not like pro your tradition, in fact, may even be enemies, give you an accurate portrayal of what's going on with Islam? This is kind of the point. And thereupon employed to describe, even interpret, not merely the overt behavior, but also the intellectual and spiritual development of helpless and mostly innocent actors. Undoubtedly, Wansbro's question is intended as rhetorical and meant to impugn the value of non-Islamic sources for understanding earliest Islam. Nonetheless, I think that the most honest and accurate answer to this question is, in fact, possibly. While such information perhaps cannot be freely extracted from these sources, I just really fast forwarded there. Okay. From these sources, analyzed with some care, they may potentially yield historically valuable information concerning the beginnings of Islam. The imperfections of Hagarism should not lead us to discount completely the important insights that both this study and its approach have to offer. While some scholars have somewhat unfairly dismissed Hagarism and its approach as either hopelessly colonialist and methodologically flawed, there is still much to gain from this seminal book. Wansbro's more considered rejection of Hagarism reflects his concern for the overwhelming and historically distorting impact of salvation history, that is, theologized sacred history on both the Islamic and non-Islamic sources. And in light of this, he essentially committed himself to a historical agnosticism regarding the origins of Islam. Yet such resignation is not our only option. Admittedly, both Wansbro and Robert Hoyland, after him, have correctly noted that non-Muslim sources alone cannot provide a complete and coherent account of the history of early Islam, as was essentially proposed in Hagarism. But this recognition does not somehow make non-Islamic witnesses to the religious history of the 7th and 8th centuries any less valuable as a whole than the early Islamic sources. And on particular points, they may possibly report more reliably than the Islamic tradition, as this study will argue. Almost all the documentary sources for understanding the formative period of Islam, including even the Quran, are highly problematic from a religious historian's viewpoint. These sources are frequently overwhelmed and controlled by a master narrative of sacred history, as well as being influenced by the social, political, and theological concerns of the particular groups that produce them. But such conditions do not present an altogether uncommon or impossible circumstance. There are ways of extracting historically credible data from such contaminated, I like the term, repositories. We must deploy methods capable of identifying different types of bias and excavating information from these sources, along the lines of those techniques used to reconstruct the historical Jesus from the highly theologized narratives of the Christian Gospels. This endeavor will not yield, to be sure, history. He put some German here. I can't speak German, so forgive me. But this was always hyper-modern fantasy in any case. Instead, we will be able to reconstruct a narrative, or quite possibly several narratives, of Islamic origins that possess a degree of probability derived from the particular methodological principles used to assess the relative reliability of various testimonies concerning the formation of Islam. Hagarism opened the door to this new approach, and in its wake, we must critically assess the strikingly dissimilar descriptions of earliest Islam often found in the non-Islamic sources of the 7th and 8th centuries and in the more traditional Islamic accounts from the later 8th and 9th centuries. While a great deal of investigation still remains to be done along these lines, the past 2 decades have already seen some excellent work in this area, much of it inspired by the initial insights of Crone and Cook. Let me check you out here in the comment section just to see how everybody's doing in the chat. Hope everybody's doing well here. Seeing everybody here. Hey, I hope everybody's doing well. Sorry if I'm just reading along. I'm trying to give everybody some of this really, really good stuff. Okay, continuing. I don't need to be distracted. I really appreciate you guys. And of course, if you have any questions or whatever, I can see color pop up in my face. Super chats are greatly appreciated. Rather than pursuing one of the many new issues that undoubtedly await exploration, the present study will return to what was surely one of Hagarism's most startling revelations: its identification of widespread reports from 7th and 8th century writers that Muhammad was still alive and leading the Islamic community as his followers began their invasion of the Roman Near East. This indication is strikingly at odds with the traditional account of Muhammad's death before the Near Eastern conquest at Medina in 632, first recorded in the earliest Islamic biographies of the mid-8th and 9th centuries. So non-Muslim sources seem to paint Muhammad alive after the time that Muslim sources say he's already dead in Medina. And this can be a conflict historically. Like, what is the truth? What's really going on historically? What actually happened? With so many unanswered questions still to pursue, and this is a kind of a conspiracy, everybody who's watching this. I mean, it's kind of like, what happened, why is one narrative in the Muslim sources say he died in 632, and then the non-Muslim sources seem to imply he's still alive? All right, with so many unanswered questions still to pursue, one might rightly question the return to an issue raised now already over 30 years ago. There are, however, several reasons for doing so. In the first place, Crone and Cook merely note the existence of this discrepancy in the sources, gathering many of the most significant references together in an endnote. Instead of carefully evaluating the historical significance of these witnesses, both individually and collectively, they conclude their list of references with only the remark: the convergence is impressive. Indeed it is. But can we say something more than this? Might a critical analysis of the sources give us some sense of how much historical weight they can bear, both individually and collectively? Is it possible that even if Muhammad did not in fact lead the Islamic conquest of Palestine, this tradition might reveal something about the nature of formative Islam? In all fairness, we are presently much better equipped to pose such questions, in large part due to the excellent work of Hoyland. Robert G. Hoyland is an academic that I'm going to be interviewing at the end of this month. It'll be pre-recorded, I imagine, because it's going to be a long one. But anyway, we'll see how that one goes. But he's a really good scholar in Islamic origins, and one of his books is in the description of this video if you want a source. The other one I would say is the one he does on the conquest, where he explains kind of the war situation and how Islam took over. I can't think of it. I've read the book, but I can't think right now. Okay, here we go. Most notably in his work, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, not only has Hoyland produced an outstanding catalog of many references to early Islam made in non-Islamic sources, but he takes the project that was begun in Hagarism an important step forward by proposing a basic methodology for evaluating the significance of these sources, as well as providing examples of its application. In essence, Hoyland proposes that we should ask three basic questions of each potential witness to assess its historical worth. What is the source of its observation about early Islam? What is the character of the observation? And what is the subject of the observation? The first question, rather straightforwardly, asks us to consider the reliability of each author's source. Was he himself an eyewitness to what he reports? Did she hear it from those who were eyewitnesses, or is it merely hearsay or gossip? Clearly, there is a descending scale of reliability as one moves down this list. In addition, Hoyland suggests that we consider the nature of the observation itself. Does the source report a simple observation of fact, or does the information in question serve some sort of apologetic agenda? And I love looking for that kind of stuff along my journey in this. Like, clever. This was an interesting apologetic. Apologetic agenda or totalizing explanation. Simple observations, Hoyland suggests, will likely have a much higher degree of historical veracity. Somewhat related to this is the third principle, which questions the nature of the matter that the non-Islamic source describes. Is it something that an outsider would likely have accurate information or knowledge of? That is, does the statement reflect something that would be readily observable by a non-Muslim, or even better, is it something that would have directly affected non-Muslims? In such cases, the witness of the non-Muslim writers is more likely to transmit reliable information. When the same writers comment on aspects of Islamic belief and intracommunal life, however, we must adopt a more skeptical approach to the reports. So is it impacting them out here in Palestine when this stuff is supposedly happening in Arabia? Or if they are in Arabia, is this somewhere in Syria that the author's writing about, and how reliable is the information? If it's talking about intracommunal life or belief within Islam, we should approach it a little more critically, because usually the communal groups that speak for themselves about what they believe might be more reliable in some respects. But if it's centuries later, this is a huge issue as well, right? Because we've seen what happened in early Christianity. I'm using the term to kind of encompass the whole issue of Jesus studies and the beliefs following Christ. Like, look at the evolution of their Christology. The earliest Christology we have is Jesus becomes Son of God after his resurrection. Earliest. Romans 1:4, and we see this hinted at in Philippians 2. That then he's taken up and ascended, and he is then like the name above all names, and by which every name will be saved, etc. So he's granted or gifted that by his death and apotheosis or ascension, resurrection, however you want to put this. The point is that becomes condemned in the 3rd century by Christians themselves. You have to encompass the whole Christology that they developed by then, and the earliest form of it, if you hold to that alone, you're a heretic. So Christians' earliest doctrine becomes heretical in the 3rd, 4th century AD. Is the earliest Muslim sources, the earliest tradition surrounding Muhammad, accurate? These are questions we're going to kind of ask ourselves as we explore critically, like we do Christianity or Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, you name it, on Islam. Hold on, here we go. Here we go. Christine Wilson, thank you for being a member. I just saw your super chat. I really appreciate it. Thanks for saving me from being born again. Well, I'm glad I could help you. I hope that you're enjoying the content. And I'm sorry I'm reading all this, but I'm also trying to take time to explain the importance I see out of it. And thank you for your support. Really appreciate that. Your indulgence will be remembered when your families are in purgatory, my friend. Don't worry. We'll get them right through it. Okay. Intracommunal life. We talked about that. All right. These are sound principles for assessing the relative worth of the various non-Islamic witnesses to the earliest history of Islam, to which I would add one further: the criterion of multiple independent attestation. One of the oldest and most fundamental principles of modern biblical criticism, and particularly important for studies of the historical Jesus, as biblical scholars have long recognized. A high degree of historical probability inheres in observations attested by several independent sources, since this pattern makes it highly unlikely that a particular writer has invented a given report. I'm not so sure that we could say that the Gospels, the Synoptics, are independent, or even John is independent of Paul. Paula Fredrickson thinks it's somehow independent. Don't know. I know academics who don't think that. But when I asked her what would be a good methodology in the New Testament on trying to assess what we can know about maybe Jesus, or the earliest forms of things we can know about Jesus, she says if you look in the Gospels and you draw a straight line and you connect it and you find it in Paul and in the Gospels, then maybe there's a connection here with multiple sources that are carrying something that goes back earlier to Jesus, and it might be reliable. And one of those just might be Jesus was crucified by the Romans. And I know that Paul doesn't explicitly say the Romans, but Paul's a Jew writing around the time of Philo, around the time of Josephus, and other Jews who are saying Romans are crucifying Jews. So it's pretty clear to me, it makes the most plausible sense that you have a crucified Jew named Jesus. And in fact, this very historical issue about Jesus being crucified gets denied by many Muslims, that he actually wasn't literally crucified. And of course, even non Orthodox Christian, which is anachronistic and of course problematic. But there are Gnostics that kind of say that Jesus wasn't really crucified. There's a phantom or Simon of Cyrene or different people were actually crucified instead of Jesus because, he's so divine. He can't be crucified. And you wonder if that tradition found its way into the Quran by the 7th century. So painting a picture here, giving you an example. When a particular tradition from the non-Islamic sources meets all of these criteria, meaning the non-Islamic sources, these are the non-Muslim sources that are before what we find in Muslim sources, and then some of them are probably contemporaneous or some might even be after. But when we find a particular tradition from those sources that meet all of these criteria and are independent attestations speaking on the same issue as if they all realize the same thing, there is a significant probability that such a report reflects genuine information about the formative period of Islam. While it cannot be said with any certainty that these witnesses disclose what really happened, such reports present high-quality information that derives from the period in question. Nevertheless, despite their exceptional value, these testimonies should not simply be taken at face value, and they need to be compared critically with relative traditions from the earliest Islamic sources. Important that we do that as well. When there is sharp disagreement with the canonical narratives of Islam's origins, as is the case with the circumstances of Muhammad's death, one must also subject the relative Islamic sources to a similar scrutiny in order to determine if the difference reflects the influence of later theological, political, literary, or other interest within the Islamic tradition. This right here is going to unravel a can of worms. We're never going to be able to explore all that here on this episode. There's just a lot. I want to give you, I'm the dope man, and I want to get you hooked here. Okay. I want you to understand why this is significant and why I really appreciate Western scholarship as I'm approaching the study of Islam, because maybe I'd be shocked to find them being as critical, but are there Muslims who are academics in their field who are being critical on their own sources the way that, let's say, Western scholars are being critical of Islamic sources? We find Christians, I'll give you an example. There are Christian academics who put their faith to the side and they study Jesus studies, and they walk away and say stuff like, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who made some predictions and he was wrong. Del C. Allison Jr., Ian Mills, other academics, these are Christians, and they say Jesus was probably wrong on some things. I cannot see how that's possible unless it's a very liberal form of Islam or something. And I could be wrong here. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'd be interested to get some feedback from Muslims who say, no, I think Muhammad probably was wrong about some stuff or something. Can we honestly assess this information if we already start with our conclusion? And that is everything that is said, that Muhammad says, that the Quran says is absolutely true. It is absolutely from God. It's perfect. Everything, yada, yada, yada. It's like, how can we actually evaluate this information, scrutinizing it critically, the way I take a scalpel to Christianity or the Hebrew Bible, you name it, if that is what we're starting with? And this is the issue, if that makes sense. I just want to recap this. So there's sharp disagreement between the canonical narratives of Islam or Islamic origins, as is the case with the circumstances of Muhammad's death. And of course, the non-Islamic and the Islamic ones, they disagree on this, in order to determine if the difference reflects the influence of later theological, political, literary, or other interest within the Islamic tradition. A Christian analogy, for those who watch me all the time, you'll find Paul's like, don't get married, like even don't have sex if you are married, if you absolutely have to, my guys, right? He's probably talking to a bunch of men in Corinth or whatever. Like, then get married if you know you're burning with lust, blah, 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 blah. But dude, the end is any day now. We need to get prepared for the end. And then you get these pastoral epistles that come in and they like talk about women need to have babies to be saved. Is this political within the church's community to try and like stop people from repopulate, like, or to get people to start birthing Christian children and to like get away from this Pauline notion and move towards Like, guys, we need to be fruitful and multiply. So are there political reasons? Are there religious reasons? Has something changed in the tradition later? And they're casting this story back as if they're writing as Peter or whoever in the pastorals. And it's really not that case. This doesn't really go back to the original sources. It's really just a later reflection on theology that's in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries back onto early Islam. These are questions that scholars have. Thank you, Ricky Johnson, for that super sticker, my friend. You are super cool. Really appreciate the love and support. All right, we're going to keep going with this. So we talked about the theological, political, literary, or other interest within the Islamic tradition. This process will involve bringing the full toolkit of historical criticism to bear on the traditions of the Quran and the earliest narratives of Islamic origins, including elements of form criticism, tradition criticism, Tindez criticism, and whenever possible, source criticism and redaction criticism. Likewise, in such circumstances, it will be important to look for any anomalies within the Islamic tradition that might corroborate the reports of the non-Islamic sources. Here, the criterion of embarrassment or dissimilarity, that is, dissimilarity from the later tradition, is particularly valuable. According to this cornerstone of historical Jesus studies, material sharply at odds with the received tradition is unlikely to have been invented by the later community. Such divergences from established belief and practice are instead likely remnants of an older formation, preserved in spite of their defiance on account of their antiquity. Let me give you an analogy. I know there are people who will suggest that the baptismal scene in Mark, even Richard Carrier, who came over and did a Gospel of Mark as mythology position, like, he doesn't take this as any historical reliability. I know other people who do that as well. But there is this argument within Jesus studies and critical scholarship that it's embarrassing. The Gospel of Mark is already trying to fix the problem with John the Baptist being Jesus's kind of head, like he is his teacher, and that Jesus is subordinate to John the Baptist by being baptized by John and for the remission of sins. Does Jesus really need forgiveness of sins? Mark has no problem with this. Matthew, So scholars look at that and go, what is Matthew so afraid of? Why is Matthew changing this, trying to fix this issue that's going on here in Mark? And of course, Luke does it even more. So why? Maybe because there's this dissimilarity or a embarrassment, criterion of embarrassment. So worth checking out. Yes, actually, good super chat here. Lost Fan says, you seen Useful Charts video, Who Wrote the Quran? Absolutely. I watched it and I recommend it. In fact, Useful Charts is a patron of MythVision. So that just gives you a little heads up. We're doing good work here. And if you haven't subscribed to Useful Charts, I highly recommend it. He's very organized and giving you good information on family trees and genealogies, you name it. I hope to have him on at some point as well. Thank you, Lost Fan, for bringing that up, actually, because it's just so clean and simple to watch his videos. Okay, continuing. According to this cornerstone of historical Jesus studies, we did that. Okay, when a number of witnesses converge to reveal the same discordant theme, there's a high probability that this material reflects a particularly early tradition that has been effaced from the canonical sources. Moreover, if evidence from the non-Islamic sources exhibits coherence with such anomalies in the early Islamic sources, then there is an even greater likelihood that this represents a primitive aspect of the Islamic faith that was either altered or abandoned by later tradition. If non-Muslim sources who are not talking with Muslim sources, they agree on an idea, something that's being said early on, and then, of course, later tradition disagrees, if you will, we would probably want to go with that earlier one where non-Muslim and Muslim sources early on agree on an idea of something happening versus later Muslim sources that might disagree with both earlier. This is what it seems like he's saying here. Hoyland has recently questioned the value of this criterion of dissimilarity or embarrassment for the reconstruction of early Islam, characterizing such reasoning as highly dubious. As evidence against the value of this principle, Hoyland refers to John Burton's explanation of the Satanic Verses episode from Muhammad's early biographies. So we're gonna bring this up here. I think this is an interesting discussion. Hold on one second. Bear with me. There we go. All right. I think this is always an interesting topic, the Satanic Verses. So John Burton's explanation of the Satanic Verses episode from Muhammad's early biographies, while scholars have overwhelmingly looked to this embarrassing moment from Muhammad's career as almost certainly genuine, since it is unthinkable that the story could have been invented by Muslims, Burton suggests that the story was indeed invented to show that Quranic verses could be divinely withdrawn without verbal replacement. Nevertheless, Burton's rather complicated argument has not gained much traction, and his proposal that the entire story was invented simply to provide justification for a particular form of Quranic abrogation is not very persuasive and certainly does not afford sufficient grounds for abolishing this core principle of historical and textual analysis. Hoyland further remarks that the reasoning behind this criterion implies that our modern views on what is favorable or not coincide with those of early Muslims. Yet Burton's alternative merely replaces this modern viewpoint with the arcane world of early Quranic exegesis, and one must admit that it is certainly no less problematic to view the origins of Islam through the lens of the medieval Islamic tradition and its interpretive categories. In this regard, Gerald Hauptwing's analysis of the Satanic Verses tradition offers a far more compelling interpretation than Burton's. Let's check out what the Satanic Verses interpretations from Gerald Hauptwing's analysis. While also preserving the value of the criterion of dissimilarity, arguing on the basis of the Quran, Hauptwing, I hope I'm saying that correctly, persuasively identifies angelic intercession rather than idolatry as the main issue here, establishing a credible context for this episode within the religious milieu reflected in the Quran. Likewise, Hauptwing makes equally clear the improbability that the story is a later fabrication based on the Quran, as well as explaining its suppression in many sources as a result of the Islamic tradition's association of Muhammad's opponents with polytheism and idolatry. Admittedly, Hoyland's caution that one must be careful about assuming that modern ideas of tension or contradiction within the Islamic tradition coincide with those of early Muslims is an important point. Such concerns certainly warrant constant and careful consideration, but they need not paralyze historical analysis. Reconstruction of the past always involves viewing its events through the lens of the present, no matter which methods or criteria the historian applies. No postmodern historian can escape the limitations of her social and intellectual context as salubrious as Hoyland's warning is to historians in general. It seems there is no alternative view from nowhere, what does not bring contemporary concerns and perspectives to the analysis of the past. If we are to abandon the toolkit of modern historical study simply because of its own historical contingencies, then we presumably must resign ourselves either to a radical historical agnosticism or to the indigenous critique of the Islamic tradition itself. Moreover, the application of this criterion of historical analysis is not simply a matter of judging a tradition either false or authentic, as Hoyland somewhat incorrectly draws the dichotomy in his critique, but instead, see where I just scrolled down a little bit. Hoyland somewhat incorrectly draws the dichotomy in his critique, but instead this method affords principles for identifying a probability that certain material is unlikely to have originated in specific historical circumstances. In the case of traditions that are strongly divergent from the beliefs and practices of 2nd and 3rd century Islam, or its canonical memories of origins, one must admit that these are less likely to have been invented by the later community than traditions undergirding the classical Islam of the Abbasid era. While Hoyland's implicit critique of modern historiography's claim to divide truth from fiction is welcome, his rejection of this method of analysis for its failure to yield such objective results is not fully persuasive. On the basis of these methodological principles, the present study will argue that the witness of certain non-Islamic sources that Muhammad survived to lead the invasion of Palestine preserves what is quite possibly a genuine early Islamic tradition, despite the fact that several recent articles would suggest otherwise. For instance, Hoyland, who generally advocates the value of non-Islamic sources for reconstructing early Islamic history, has somewhat surprisingly taken the opposing view. In his study of Muhammad's life as reported in Christian writings, Hoyland initially notes the clear witness of these sources to Muhammad's sustained vitality, but then rather strangely concludes that these sources are collectively mistaken in their notice of a later date for Muhammad's death. Without much explanation at all, he declares the accuracy of the traditional Islamic sources on this matter, despite the fact that his own criteria could seem to favor the reliability of the Christian sources in this case. So he pretty much is having his reasons, but not accepting the non-Muslim sources on this particular case as giving what historically may have happened with Muhammad, that Muhammad may have existed or stayed alive after 632, as Muslim sources say. He died in Medina. So, and it seems that Stephen J. Shoemaker thinks using Hoyland's own methodology, you would want to actually favor the non-Muslim sources in this criteria rather than the Muslim sources. To my knowledge, the only other study to address the relationship between the various Christian accounts of the Arab conquest and the Islamic biographies of Muhammad, specifically in any detail, is an article entitled La Sira du Prophète Mohammed et las Conquêtes. I can't even read this. It's an article published in the proceedings from a conference on the life of Muhammad some 30 years ago. Unfortunately, its author, Bertold Spuler, not only disregards some of the most important sources, but he rather astonishingly asserts the fundamental harmony of all sources and completely overlooks their differences concerning Muhammad's involvement in the Palestinian campaign. Finally, we may add to this report, a report in the popular media that Crone and Cook have allegedly backed away from their earlier views concerning the date of Muhammad's death as expressed in Hagarism. Although I have not yet found any evidence of such a retraction in print, in fact, to the contrary, Cook has maintained the significance of the non-Islamic sources on this point, writing in the same year as the article in question that non-Muslim sources written, and these are quotations, non-Muslim sources written in the following decades after 632 give only very scrappy information and are subject to problems of their own. One point of interest is that they suggest that Muhammad was still alive when the Muslim expansion outside Arabia began. Even more recently, Crone has similarly written that these sources convey the impression that he was actually leading the invasions. Muhammad's death is normally placed in 632, but the possibility that it should be placed 2 or 3 years later cannot be completely excluded. In light of rather negative assessment of this report of Muhammad's vitality during the Palestinian invasion has received in recent publications, it seems necessary to revisit the question of Muhammad's death, not so much with the goal of determining when he really died, but with an eye toward whether these non-Islamic sources may in fact preserve an early tradition that was subsequently revised as Islam's self-image and self-understanding were transformed. Let me try to give you an example of that here. Okay, within Christianity, we used Christology earlier. The development of Jesus and how they understand divine and deities and such later reflects Jesus as something greater beyond comprehension, to the point where he's equal with the Father, actually. Whereas in earlier sources, Jesus is actually a subordinate of the Father, and it becomes actual heresy, heretical, to act like Jesus is lower in some respects to the Father. So Christians capitalize on this later, and they say, oh, it was like this from the start. So I imagine that is just an analogy, but in what Dr. Stephen J. Shoemaker is saying here, early tradition that was subsequently revised as Islam's self-image and self-understanding were transformed, you see this change later. And is there good reason in this self-image, self-understanding to place Muhammad's death in 632 rather than him leading the invasion in Palestine? These are questions to ask. What the answer is, who knows, really? This is all just based on our sources, and what you're going to say makes better sense. But it's an interesting question that isn't really being taken as serious and as widespread as it should be in the scholarship, according to Shoemaker. And he says this book seems to determine if Muhammad's leadership during the invasion of Palestine is something that might have comported with the beliefs of the earliest Muslims insofar as they can be known, and likewise, if there are reasons to suspect that there might have been cause to re-remember, notice that term, re-remember the end of his life differently at a later point. The larger purpose of this investigation thus lies not in the possibility of adjusting the date of Muhammad's death by a few years. Instead, this difference in the early sources affords an important opening through which to explore the nature of primitive Islam more broadly. Likewise, this study aims to demonstrate the potential value of non-Islamic sources for reconstructing the history of formative Islam. When these sources are used in a methodologically critical manner and in conjunction with rather than isolation from Islamic sources, while others have already made similar demonstrations, including Lawrence Conrad and Hoyland in particular, in view of the generally negative reception of Hagarism and its approach within Islamic studies as a whole, it would appear that this point bears repeating. So he wants to open this case again. And I don't blame him. I mean, it's always good to ask, right, these questions and to wonder, hey, did they kind of repaint their image? Is there reconfiguration happening? And are there reasons politically, theologically, whatever, later to re-remember Muhammad in a different respect? Something to consider. I mean, we do know that many, if I could use the term Gnostic Christians, which is really a bad category, they're already like co-opting and syncretizing various things in different ways that even earlier sources like from Paul and such aren't doing. And they're already like repainting the picture and doing things with Jesus that you kind of go, what's going on here? Okay. A related goal, hold on, this blasting in my ears. There we go. Okay, a related goal of the study is to work toward narrowing the divide that exists between the study of religion and culture in Mediterranean late antiquity and the investigation of Islamic origins, an objective that it shares with much recent scholarship on late antiquity and early Islam. In both its methods and its conclusions, this monograph presents a case for interpreting the beginnings of Islam more within the context of the broader late ancient world rather than according to the more traditional view of Islam's formation in the relative isolation of the Hijaz. I love this. I love this. This is important. Ask Christians if Jesus is similar or comparative to other gods around, or if there's some borrowing or at least imitation taking place of Greek literature, Greek gods, the Mediterranean world at large, etc., and painting it into Jesus. Now, there are probably some Christians out there who are more advanced and more progressive in their approach. They're not fundamentalist, and they'll say, yeah. I think that Paul, absolutely, when he's run into these Gentiles who are out there in the Roman world, he's using stuff from this world that he knows, and he's making Jesus accommodate to that and having them want to join the movement. Whoop-de-doo. Most Christians will say, no, Jesus is wholly separate, absolutely unique. Nobody's like him, etc., etc. And I've heard this of Muhammad as well. And you kind of ask yourself, using the historical methodology, what does the world around have impact? You ask more radical fundamentalists in Islam, the Muslims, and they'll say, Christians, Jews, there wasn't really much impact. In fact, I've even heard some say Christianity wasn't even in this area. I've heard that. I'm not saying that's the broad understanding, because don't generalize everybody, but there are some who want to divorce Christianity from its existence in the region. We have archaeological findings recently that right near where all this stuff is beginning, there are Christian churches. We have actually churches that were taken over by Muslims, and they just kind of reconfigured it as a Islamic place of worship. And so they're co-opting the surrounding religions and the practices that are around, whether it be Jewish, maybe even pagan, and of course Christianity. And you also have to assume that the readers of the Quran are aware of these biblical figures, Abraham and Moses, and you name it, because they're not like all the scholars I've talked to, Ivan Putin and other scholars, Sean Anthony, Robert Hoyland, they like recognize that whoever the author of the Quran or authors, I don't know exactly who wrote, put this in text, maybe Umar in the final redacted form we have, who knows? They're like talking to the choir. The choir has heard the preaching. They know the stories. This isn't something completely radically new, even though in their origin stories, I call it a story or mythology, they kind of paint it like the whole world is absolutely pagan. And they go into the cave and go to sleep for centuries. Next thing you know, the world is Muslim or is following, the truth of the one God, etc. So you see that in Christian traditions as well, the sleepers of Ephesus, and they go into the cave and they come out and the world is Christian all of a sudden when it was all pagan. Anyway, I rambled off of this point, and I'm saying we need to factor in bigger than just the tradition and the narrative we're given by those who are within the faith. That doesn't mean cut it off. It means factor it in and consider, but like compare it, right? When you look at how Christianity develops, when you look at these kind of things, it's something to keep in mind. That doesn't mean Christianity developed identical to Islam, but there seems to be patterns in human nature. And if we see how people act and how religions develop, my buddy recently, Matthew Hart, he just wrote an article called Cognitive Dissonance and talking about the origins of Christianity in cognitive dissonance studies. Cognitive dissonance studies also on failed apocalyptic predictions is a very important thing to read. I got a book back here. Try to find it for you. Oh. Alrighty. Okay, here we are. So this right here, when prophecy failed, right? Cognitive dissonance in prophetic traditions of the Old Testament. It gives you actually a really good background on the Hebrew Bible. And it's important that anyone who's, studying this and understands that, then looks into the New Testament, sees that. There's another one, When Prophecy Fails. I highly recommend people study that or read that book. It talks about a UFO cult that predicted the time things were going to end. And of course, it didn't end, and the movement stayed alive. And exactly like they predicted, they doubled down and just changed what they believed about it. So Stephen J. Shoemaker wrote a book about the empires of faith and apocalypticism, and how in this time, the world, right? We're going to factor in the bigger world, not just this little bubble within this tradition. The world, Heraclius, the Roman emperor, and then the emperor, if you could call him that, of the Persian Empire, and how they thought the end was coming soon. There was apocalyptic fervor in the 7th century. Does that impact Muhammad? Is there an impact happening in Arabia, and they think that the end is going to happen soon? Some hadith tradition, and of course, I suspect Dr. Shoemaker thinks that there is more, even in the Quran, about the end and an expectation. There seems to be different phases in the Quran, but my point is, if humans practice and do the same patterns when things fail, can we predict? Can we predict and see, hey, humans seem to be repeating themselves? And that's something I would say factoring in as you're studying this stuff. So, all right, let me continue here. Bear with me. Okay, so the broader study of religion and the culture in Mediterranean late antiquity and the investigation of Islamic origins, an objective that it shares with much recent scholarship on late antiquity and early Islam. In both its methods and its conclusions, this monograph presents a case for interpreting the beginnings of Islam more within the context of the broader late ancient world, rather than according to the more traditional view of Islam's formation in the relative isolation of the Hijaz. By interpreting the rise of Islam in continuity with, rather than separation from, the world of Mediterranean late antiquity, we are sure to gain new perspectives on both. Moreover, this study aims to demonstrate the value of studying Islamic origins using the same methods and perspectives that have long been utilized in the investigation of early Christianity and early Judaism. The hermeneutics of suspicion have profoundly affected the modern study of formative Christianity and Judaism, but this skeptical approach has yet to significantly affect the comparative, more sanguine attitudes often displayed by scholars of early Islam. Accordingly, this book is aimed not only at scholars of early Islam, but also at scholars of the New Testament and early Christianity. It is hoped that by attempting to bridge the disciplines of Christian and Islamic origins methodologically, this study might generate further comparison or comparative discussion among experts in both fields. This investigation thus will adopt the more skeptical approach to the sources that is characteristic of the historical critical study of early Christianity and the historical figure of Jesus. It expects of early Islamic traditions that they meet the same rigorous criteria that scholars of formative Christianity have applied in judging the historicity of traditions contained in early Christian literature. Although this study will treat traditional narratives of Islamic origins with a great deal of suspicion, this will not exceed the skepticism that scholars of religious history bring to bear on similar narratives of Christian origins. It is very important to stress this methodological consistency, particularly in light of the fact that the Sirah traditions and their historicity have lately become a sensitive issue in contemporary Islam. While the medieval Islamic tradition was itself rather circumspect regarding the historical authenticity of these traditions, in more recent years, largely in response to the historical critical study of these traditions in the West, the Sirah traditions have become in the Islamic world almost a holy writ, whose reliability was accepted almost without asking questions. The result is a deep and widening gap between Western and Islamic interpretation of both the Sirah traditions and the Hadith more generally. The methodological skepticism that guides much modern scholarship on these topics is often rejected out of hand by traditional Islamic scholarship and occasionally seen as an attack on Islam itself. So, you ask a fundamentalist Christian if MythVision attacks Christianity, of course. Of course. But am I being critical? Am I taking historical methodology to do so? Sure. Do I engage with anti-apologetics? Sure. But I have many Christians, I hope to let you know this, many Christians who actually support MythVision on Patreon. They financially support what I do and they private message me all the time. And they're like, man, I love that episode. I don't draw your ontological conclusions, but I'm impressed with the scholarship you're bringing, and I'm loving learning what you're teaching. Christians can do that. And I hope the dialogue continues. But we find this issue that happens that if you're being critical, they find it as an attack on Islam. You almost just have to grant that they're right and their belief is right, that their religion is right. The Sirah and the Hadith are accurate, at least the ones that they accept are accurate. And you can't say that they're not in a lot of cases. There are a few Muslims that absolutely impress me. And there are those on Twitter and elsewhere that I've gotten comments from who are mature and saying, I disagree with your conclusions, but I'm glad we're having conversations. And I'm glad the research is happening. I encourage that attitude. But I have had scholars, and these are many scholars that I've talked to in the West, and I cannot name names because I don't care to do that, who have told me the ridicule that they get for being critical, the kind of emails they get from Islamic scholars. And I'm talking about Islamic as in like they are Muslims themselves and they are against Western scholars in many ways, not all, but like we've got to be able to have these conversations. It's just like Gary Habermas or these other academics who love to engage with Bart Ehrman and other scholars, but at the end of the day, they really want to just show how ridiculous and how wrong Bart Ehrman is, and they want to prove they're apologetic. That's what I imagine might be going on because it's happening in Christian studies. Why wouldn't it be happening in Islamic studies? So I get a lot of like cheers when I'm like dismantling Christianity from some of my Muslim friends. And then when I go to Islam, it's like, dude, man, you were cool until you didn't realize that this is the truth. And you're, ours is 100% right. And you can't criticize it because there's nothing to criticize. There's nothing wrong. Unless you line up with what we've already criticized within the hadith or whatever traditions we don't say are reliable or credible. We do all that. You need to just follow what we say about it. And of course, MythVision's not, we're not doing that. We're doing historical critical methodology. And that means no matter what it is, we can investigate, we can look into it, and we can analyze it. Let me just check here. I imagine everybody in the chat, just give me a 1 for anybody in the chat. Do we have a lot of people in the chat right now that are just, I haven't even paid attention to it, that are definitely not digging what I'm saying here and they don't like this? I'm curious. Let me know. I'm interested to see, like, has there been a lot of back and forth with people like that are just not loving what I'm saying already? Let me scroll up here. I'll come back and check you out here in a minute. Did I miss anything? Make sure I get these super chats. I see a couple here. I look 05. Will you have on Thomas Alexander? Brilliant. I need to search Thomas Alexander real quick here. Is this an Islamic scholar or like a scholar in early Islam or Thomas Alexander? Curious if this is a scholar or... I see another YouTube channel by Thomas Alexander, but I don't see if there's like a PhD or an academic that is in particular. I don't know. Let me know if that is some scholar. I'm curious, but I'm also very cautious about the polemics that go on between Christian apologists who are writing against Islam or trying to prove somehow Islam is really secretly Christian and originally, and then it changes. There's so many things that make me go, is that necessary? Because, you know, Paul wasn't a Christian, for example. Paul was a Christ follower. He wasn't a Christian. That term comes later. Paul was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a Christian. That stuff's a bit anachronistic. So please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to see what you have and what is so good that Thomas Alexander brings to the table. Hammond, thank you for the super chat. Blood for the blood god. Don't know. Don't know what you're getting at there, Hammond, but I really appreciate the super chat. Lost fan again in the house. Loving this stuff. Talk to apostate prophet, maybe. I have many times in the past, and you know, me and him get along. We're good buddies, and but I'm like, here's the thing. Even with apostate prophet, right? He's ex-Muslim. I am interested in both ex-Muslim testimony, right, of where they come from, because I'm an ex-Christian who came out of Christianity. But I'm also really wanting to get to the scholars. What do the PhDs in the field say about source material? That kind of stuff. That's been my journey within Christianity. While I definitely interview people who've left bad situations, cults, whatever, I'm curious about the historical questions and not just polemics. So he has a different style than me, for sure. His channel is very polemical against Muslims and Islam, whereas I'm more interested in the historical question, even if that historical question, in effect, gets under the skin of a fundamentalist. If that makes sense. So, all right, here we go. I look 05. Thomas Alexander is a scholar. He argues it started as non-Trinitarian Christianity. Patrician Crone disciple. He's not a polemicist. Okay. Please email me. Thank you for that super chat. Email me at mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. I think my email is in the description. Should be. Let's see. There's my email. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Anyway, I think I'll get distracted from just stuff in the chat that I just find not even worth entertaining. I actually have had Robert Spencer on. He told me to take down the video because I put a note and I pinned it saying I don't agree with many of the views that I'm sure he concludes. And he has so much baggage of like Hindu nationalists and stuff that are attached that like I'm definitely like putting a warning here because I'm certain that he probably has a shtick toward Muslims. And at the end of the day, he told me to take down the video, which I would have been happy to keep up, but he wanted that thing removed or else not keep it up there. Look, I'm not interested. He has too much shit that comes with his baggage that I'm not interested in dealing with because I really do want to have these good conversations that go back and forth, but it's so polemical, not interested. Now, David Wood, I've messaged him about having him at some point just appear, but he hasn't wrote me back. So yeah, what do you do? What do you do? Appreciate that. I'm going to continue in this. We're almost done with the introduction to this book. I'm really hoping that everybody will check out Dr. Stephen J. Shoemaker's book here. This divide between modern secular and traditional Islamic scholarship over the historical reliability of the Sirah and Hadith presents an important context for understanding both the nature and intentions of this investigation into early Islamic history. The study and the methods that it employs are in no way aimed at casting doubt on the religious truth of the Islamic tradition. Instead, this book explores a particular aspect of formative Islam from a point of view outside the Islamic tradition, with explicit commitments to the principles of modern secular historical criticism and the hermeneutics of suspicion rather than fidelity to the traditions and values of the Islamic faith. When approached from this secular perspective, with its specific concerns and commitments, the formative period of Islam will rather obviously look quite different than it does from within the Ummah. It is important to recognize, however, that both perspectives on Islamic origins are certainly valid, and within their own context and communities, they are rightly understood to disclose truth. One approach interprets early Islam from the outside, confessing the skepticism of the secular academy, while the other presents a sacred history of formative Islam, a narrative that both shapes and is shaped by the Islamic faith and its community. Neither perspective then can claim to represent an unbiased account of the Islamic origins that somehow is obvious to any objective observer. Both understandings are fully intelligible only within the particular interpretive communities that produce them. Moreover, one perspective does not necessarily invalidate the other, and the conclusions of traditional Islamic and modern secular scholarship can both rightly claim to be valid within their own cultural and intellectual context. In fact, it is quite possible for an individual to approach a particular issue simultaneously from both a secular point of view and a confessional one. As numerous Western scholars have demonstrated, I said this earlier in the live stream, many Christian academics have come onto MythVision's channel being critical and saying it like it is about Jesus studies. And, you know, they may have differences to people that I have on, other academics that I have on, but at the end of the day, they're able to draw conclusions that even within their own tradition typically are not accepted. Okay. I don't know if Dr. Shoemaker is making that point here, but I don't know if there are Muslim scholars who hold to the faith of Islam who do that. That's something that I need to investigate further. Okay. What must be conceded on all sides, however, is that truth depends on the context of an interpretive community, be it religious or secular, and there is no objective truth that will appear as such to every individual and in every cultural context. This approach then does not negate the truth of Islamic accounts of formative Islam. They are in fact true for those whose worldview has been and continues to be shaped most fundamentally by the Islamic tradition. Scrolling up here. Likewise, those outside the Islamic faith community will not necessarily find Islam's representation of its own early history to be true in the same way that Muslims do. In similar fashion, however, secular knowledge must also recognize the situatedness of its own truth claims. It may only claim to be objective, perhaps in the somewhat limited sense that it approaches Islam, for instance, from the outside, and thus as an object of study. So this is a way of trying to say, like, within the bubble of Islam, if you're within the tradition, you can find a way where the tradition is true. To a person on the outside, everything they say to someone who's probably within that bubble is false. Or at least they're not, it's apples to oranges. They're approaching this completely different. Finally, if some readers may perhaps think it entirely implausible that the Islamic tradition has incorrectly preserved something as significant as the time and place of its founder's death, a quick glance at formative Christianity is instructive. Undoubtedly, many scholars of early Islam will want to persist in maintaining the accuracy of the traditional Islamic accounts of Muhammad's death and burial, regarding the deviant reports considered in this study as simply misinformed errors coming from those outside the Islamic community. Yet it is not at all clear why the traditional Islamic narratives of Muhammad's death should warrant such such implicit confidence, particularly in the face of this alternative early tradition. The simple fact that the Islamic accounts were produced by insiders in no way guarantees the accuracy of their information, any more so than one would presume that the Christian Gospels accurately record the life and death of Jesus on the basis of their production by insiders. Instead, to the contrary, it is for this very reason that New Testament scholars are generally suspicious, indeed, of the gospel accounts, seeking to test them whenever possible by quality evidence drawn from external sources. This sharp contrast with the study of early Islam is seen quite clearly in F.E. Peters' recent comparative study, Jesus and Muhammad, where the discussion of Jesus begins with evidence from the pagan and Jewish sources, while evidence from non-Islamic sources for the beginnings of Islam is rather strangely ignored. Pausing there, I see a super chat. Someone wants to go to heaven, hallelujah. Let me check you out here. Who is it? I really appreciate that super chat. Humanist Reformation. Keep exposing all these religious cons while keeping it balanced. Too many religions pushing lies and legislating others with those lies. Keep it up, Derek. Humanist Reformation. This is a perfect example of actually what we're doing here, right? So people within the tradition are saying the Western secular methodology is a lie. But I need to point this out for my Muslim friends who might watch this and are listening to me discuss this topic. The Christian fundamentalists look at me exactly the same way. They think that I am absolutely wrong, that I have drawn wrong conclusions, that the narratives, the gospels are historically, factually accurate. They are portraying what happened. They're reliable, et cetera, et cetera. And I imagine the same thing is being said about from the Muslim side on pertaining to Islam, the Sirah, Hadith, the biographies, all of that. And I really appreciate the support, Humanist Reformation, because I hope more people will see, from my perspective, right? I think naturalism makes the most sense. Look at these religions using historical methodology and draw some conclusions. This is my personal. I have that as part of just educating the general audience in the world, but also I do have that as something I hope to do. I hope people will see why I don't draw that this is ontologically true. This is one of my multiple biases, if you will. So thank you for the support. Really appreciate that in the chat. The earliest extant Gospels were written between 40 and 70 years after the death of Jesus, based in part on earlier literary sources that had begun to form perhaps some 20 years after his death, a considerably smaller interval than the time elapsed between Muhammad's death and his earliest biographies. Yet, despite the fact that Jesus' biography took written form more quickly than did Muhammad's, the Gospels have significant disagreements in chronology, including perhaps most famously the differences between the Synoptic and Johannine, or John, the Gospel of John, Gospels regarding the length of Jesus's ministry. Likewise, the date of Jesus' death, for instance, can only be known approximately 28 to 33 CE, yet perhaps more comparable with the tradition of Muhammad's death in Medina are actually the accounts of Jesus' birth. These reveal that Only half a century after Jesus' death, the early Christians had created a historically improbable tradition of his birth in Bethlehem to serve the needs of Christian salvation history. So Bethlehem is not where he was born according to the earlier synoptic account. It's Nazareth is where he's from. Still more apt is the comparison of Islam's apostle with early Christian traditions about its apostles. Take, for example, the apostle Peter, whose death and burial are located in Rome by multiple independent reports written just over a century after the fact. There is even an early tomb identified as the site of this burial, yet there is considerable debate as to whether Peter was ever even in Rome. And the most recent analysis argues rather persuasively that in fact he was not. Likewise, traditions from the 2nd century identify Ephesus as the Apostle John's final resting place, some of which are allegedly based on oral transmission spanning only 2 generations. Yet the strong consensus of the New Testament scholarship rejects the accuracy of these reports. If then early Christian traditions concerning Jesus and the apostles could be subject to such manipulation over the course of just a century or less, or even less, how much more so might one expect to find similar developments in the early Islamic biographies of Muhammad, whose contents are widely regarded as highly stylized and untrustworthy? Such adjustments to a religious tradition's memory of its early history are in fact not at all unusual and need not be judged as either deceptive or the product of some insidious conspiracy, as some scholars of early Islam have wanted to insist. To the contrary, it is quite common to find that a religious community has revised certain important aspects of its formative history to comport with its most cherished theological principles, as the Christian nativity traditions bear witness. Often, such revisions serve to extend and intensify the interpretive power and cohesion of a religion's core narrative by incorporating I'm sitting here trying to follow this thread. Narrative by incorporating various important religious symbols and practices into the story of its origins. The early Christian gospel writers, like Muhammad's early biographers, presumably simply were not interested in writing an objective description of past events in the fashion that modern history values. Their narratives urgently seek to communicate the truth about Jesus Christ and the meaning of his life, death, and resurrection. To expect a dispassionate inventory of events would be both anachronistic and absurd. Moreover, the pious fictions of early Christian literature would be wrongly condemned as frauds or deceptions. To the contrary, they undoubtedly were efforts to proclaim the truth as seen by the authors and their communities with perfect clarity. One would only expect that similar impulses and developments are to be found in the nascent Islamic tradition. And as I will argue, the early Islamic traditions of the end of Muhammad's life, much like the Christian nativity traditions, appear to have adopted the arc of his biography to fit the needs of early Islamic identity and salvation history nearly a century after his death. Consequently, our knowledge of exactly when Muhammad died is not nearly as certain as much previous scholarship has assumed, and it seems we must accordingly adjust our historical estimate for the end of his life to somewhat more approximately within the period 632 to 635. This reappraisal's wild. All right, just checking to make sure I didn't miss anybody. I did. Avros in the house. You should invite Christian polemicists to discuss problems in Islam. I know that's not your modus operandi, but these are more willing to say it out loud. So we were just, Avros, you're a little late to the party, I think. And we were mentioning David Wood. And I told him, hey, man, if you want to come have a talk, come have a talk. I'd like to hear what he has discovered. And I imagine that we would disagree on Christianity, but he would be willing. This is the interesting if I'm like standing back as a doctor with a pen and pad watching and observing how Christians are quick to go at Islam and be critical, I'm like, oh, wow, interesting. And then watch them like run to the like absolute fundamentalist approach on Christianity and Jesus. I'm like, what just happened there in his brain? Like, why did he do that? Why is it this, like, I get to this and now I'm like special pleading, double standard, and I gotta, make sure this is true. And it's really interesting to see that. But I've had Rabbi Tovia Singer come on, and he's actually like tried to poke holes and show you what's going on in the New Testament and Christianity. I imagine that if you go to Orthodox Judaism or the Hebrew Bible, you're not going to find that critical methodology that you see the scholarship that is critical of the Hebrew Bible is showing. And I imagine the same for David Wood or anybody else. So I'm happy to do something like that. It's just a matter of whether or not he would want to come on the channel and to discuss these matters. I really appreciate the 5. I appreciate that super chat. And I hope everybody in the chat is having a good day. I'm just checking to make sure I didn't miss anything else here while I'm not reading and stuttering my words. I'm using a new computer here, so it's just different on me. Okay, I'm going to continue. All right, the first chapter of the study examines the various sources from the 7th and 8th centuries that attest to Muhammad's survival and leadership. At the time of the initial assault on the Roman Near East, circa 634-635, although later sources, particularly from the Christian tradition, continues to this text, I can't make out what the word repcat. I can't make out what that says because the font isn't right. Repcat, this tradition, this chapter focuses on witnesses from the 1st century and a half after Muhammad's death. Sources from this period hold special value as potential bearers of early traditions that may subsequently have been displaced once the canonical narratives of Islamic origins came to be established during the later 8th century. At that time, Ibn Ishaq's officially sanctioned biography of Muhammad, as well as the teachings of other contemporary Medinan traditionalists, began to be widely known. From this point onward, the life of Muhammad, as remembered by Muslims and non-Muslims alike, was largely governed by the contents of these canonical biographies. Early evidence of their influence outside of the Islamic tradition can be seen already in the early 9th century Chronicle of Theophanes, which owing to direct influence from Islamic sources, is the first non-Islamic source to correctly relate Muhammad's decease prior to the invasion of Palestine. So I wish I had that chronicle up to show you and when it was dated and stuff, but this is the first non-Muslim source that actually agrees with this earlier 632 date, I guess, of the death of Muhammad. The fact that later Christian sources, and in particular the Western Christian accounts of Muhammad's death surveyed by Etten Kohlberg, should largely adhere to the traditional Islamic chronology is merely testimony to the ascendancy and authority of these canonical biographies within the Islamic tradition of the 2nd and later centuries. All right, let me do this here real quick. Bear with me. I am trying to pop something up here to make my life a little easier. All right. 11 different sources from this period, including even one from the Islamic tradition itself. So I don't know if that means 10 non-Muslim sources and then a Muslim source or whatnot, indicate Muhammad's continued survival at the beginning of the Near Eastern conquest. So he's saying that many of these non-Muslim sources say he's still alive in this conquest. And there's one Muslim source that actually says he's still alive. That's interesting. Each of these documents is first evaluated individually to assess the quality of its testimony. Then the chapter considers the collective value of these reports, reaching the conclusion that they convincingly bear witness to an early tradition that Muhammad was still alive and leading the Islamic community as his followers invaded Roman Syria and Palestine. This tradition, it would appear, reached each of the various religious communities of the early Islamic empire by the beginning of the 2nd century AH, which that's the 2nd century after Muhammad's, I believe, death, or he did a 10-year journey. I could be wrong. I'm horrible with this. And it is not contradicted by the more traditional chronology of Muhammad's decease until after the composition of Ibn Ishaq's influential biography of Muhammad around 750 CE. So now he's using CE. And that's what always confused me when I was getting into Islamic studies up front, was like they use a different calendar. The calendar is based off Muhammad and not AD, after death of Jesus, or CE and such. So as such, this divergent tradition regarding the end of Muhammad's life merits serious historical consideration. The following chapter turns to the traditional Islamic account of Muhammad's death and burial, focusing especially on Ibn Ishaq's biography, the earliest surviving Islamic narrative of Muhammad's life and the beginnings of Islam. Here, the details of Muhammad's sudden illness, his demise, and his interment, as recorded in his collection, are first described and then compared with other early biographical sources in order to determine which traditions might possibly derive from early authorities. The results of this endeavor, however, prove rather meager, and most of the material concerning Muhammad's death and burial in Ibn Ishaq's biography cannot be assigned to any earlier figure. While a limited number of traditions can be attributed to Ibn Ishaq's teacher, al-Zuhri, 742 CE, these reveal only Muhammad's sudden illness and death in an urban context, surrounded by his wife's and in the vicinity of a place of prayer where his followers regularly gathered to worship. The location of Muhammad's death and burial in Medina and the chronology of these events relative to the Near Eastern conquest, however, cannot be ascribed with any assurance to al-Zuhri. Ibn Ishaq's biography remains the earliest witness to these traditions, and while one certainly cannot entirely exclude the possibility that he had received this information from al-Zuhri or some other early authority, there is no evidence for this hypothesis. This chapter continues to consider the issue of chronology within the early biographies of Muhammad more generally, observing that modern scholarship judges the traditional chronology of Muhammad's life to be among the most artificial and unreliable elements of these narratives, apparently devised by his biographers only near the end of the first Islamic century. Moreover, a handful of sources from the early Islamic tradition indicate either a period of 7 or 13 years for Muhammad's Medinan period instead of 10 years, or a date for the Hijrah, and I think it was the Hijrah that what I was trying to get at was the Hijrah. I couldn't think of the word of the dating. But anyway, the Hijrah of 624 to 625 instead of 621 to 622. These variants reveal a significant pattern consistent with the possible revision of an earlier tradition of Muhammad's death in order to place these events prior to the invasion of Palestine. Finally, chapter 2 examines several anomalous reports from Ibn Ishaq's biography that could suggest traces of an older tradition associating Muhammad with the assault on Palestine. On the whole, these features of Muhammad's earliest biographies invite a possibility that the traditional memory of Muhammad's death in the Hijaz prior to the invasion of the Near East is a relatively recent development. Nevertheless, such significant revisions to the ending of Muhammad's life in early Islamic memory would seem to require some sort of substantial catalyst. Several broad literary tendencies of the early biographical traditions could seem to favor these changes, including particularly the strong influence of certain biblical typologies on the structure of the narrative. So I imagine like they paint Muhammad in the image of an earlier prophet or something like that. And I put a source down in the description for those who are curious or interested in investigating further. Sean Anthony's book on the historical Muhammad, and he pretty much goes and shows like, was he a merchant? Was he a shepherd? And are there theological reasons to paint him as a shepherd who never left Arabia instead of a merchant who would have traveled and possibly been outside of Arabia? Are there theological reasons? Is there biblical precedence to see him as that kind of prophet, like a shepherd, like David, like Moses, like these other figures? And is that invented about the life of Muhammad? I always recommend reading scholarship. So Sean Anthony, he sources so much in that book. And if you're wanting to take critical scholarship to the bank, go check him out. Did I miss anybody in the chat? Making sure I didn't miss anybody in the chat. All right, I scrolled up. I didn't see anything. All right. Okay, so several broad literary tendencies of the early biographical traditions could seem to favor these changes, including particularly the strong influence of certain biblical typologies on the structure of the narrative. Nevertheless, while these tendencies may have contributed to such a reconfiguration of Muhammad's biography, they do not in themselves seem sufficient to have generated this change. The second half of this monograph accordingly identifies evidence of significant ideological shifts in early Islamic eschatology. I love the study of eschatology. I'm curious to investigate further Stephen J. Shoemaker's understanding of this. Confessional identity and sacred geography that profoundly transformed the nature of Muhammad's original religious movement. These dramatic changes not only provide a context that can account for the existence of an early tradition associating Muhammad with the invasion of Palestine, but they also present circumstances that would explain a need to sever his connection with the Near Eastern conquest and instead to memorialize the death of Islam's founding prophet in the Hijaz. So are there theological reasons to see Muhammad theologically and politically and, of course, sacred geography to have him down there instead of making it Jerusalem, right? I was actually recently there on the Temple Mount, and I saw the Dome of the Rock, and I was there. I did videos there. I recorded a lot. And I thought to myself, if there is an earlier tradition and Muhammad really did come here, the question is, like, they were praying in this direction even. Like, many burials were taking place in the direction of Jerusalem. And I've done videos in the past on this. You kind of wonder, like, did the shift of early Islam and focusing on Jerusalem as its center point or its main focus of religious significance change for political, theological? Could that be the case? I think this is an important question to look into. Real quick, anybody in the chat got it? Says, what drugs is this guy on? I used to be on plenty of drugs, my friend. Not on any drugs anymore. Appreciate everybody in the chat. Hit the like button. Let the algorithm gods know that we exist. Chapter 3 argues that Muhammad was an eschatological prophet who, together with his earliest followers, expected to witness the imminent end of the world in the divine judgment of the hour, seemingly within his own lifetime. I can't wait to get into this, because this is exactly what we see in Hebrew literature. Get the book. In Christian literature, New Testament studies, Del C. Allison Jr., I'd just say recommend you check him out. And now I'm hearing it in Islamic literature. See a pattern here. Much 20th century scholarship, particularly in English, has sought to minimize this aspect of earliest Islam, identifying Muhammad instead as a social reforming prophet. Man, I see that about Jesus all the time as well. John Dominic Crossan kind of wants to, he doesn't say Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, but he's like, I wonder, even if he was wrong about the time, was he wrong about what he said? He's kind of going to bat, I feel, for Jesus. And instead of just seeing him as an apocalyptic prophet who was wrong about the end. So, okay, particularly in English, have sought to minimize this aspect of earliest Islam, identifying Muhammad instead as a social reforming prophet of ethical monotheism. While that may play a role to some degree, you kind of wonder, does it have to be either or? But the evidence of the Quran and certain early apocalyptic, or more precisely eschatological hadith, clearly show that Muhammad and the early members of his religious movement believed that they would soon see the end of history. Moreover, it seems rather likely that the eschatological fervor shared by Muhammad and his earliest followers was a driving force behind the Islamic conquest of the Near East. Their anticipation of the hour was, it would appear, closely linked with the restoration of Abraham's descendants to the Promised Land. This is so important. It's like Christian Zionists today who say, we got to get the Jews back to the land and the end will happen. Like, let's get the Jews back into their land and the end will happen. And there's, just to keep in mind, I don't know if he's going to say this. I haven't even read this introduction completely yet. I started it and I was like, I got to read this to my audience to get people a taste as to why this is significant and Islam is worthy of investigating critically using the methodology we do here at MythVision. But if you look at some of this stuff, you're going to find that they're called Saracens. The early Arabs that followed Muhammad were called Saracens. And then you had the Jews. And the Saracens claimed to be sons of Ishmael, and their brothers were the sons of Isaac. So here you have Ishmael and Isaac, which you have the Jews, and you have the Saracens, or the early Arabs. And they get called this in early literature as if they're both coming together to conquer Jerusalem in non-Muslim sources. This is fun. Worth checking it out. Avros, thank you for the heads up, man. Thank you for correcting that and making it clear. The after Hijra, migration to Medina, circa 622 AD, he's suggesting we need to like span that to 622 to 625. Like, early sources disagree on when this actually happened. Worthy of investigation. Thank you for that super chat and for helping me in my non-omniscience here on MythVision. So is closely linked to the restoration of Abraham's descendants to the promised land. Yet when Muhammad died before the eschaton's arrival and the hour continued to be delayed, man, this sounds like Christianity. The early Muslims had to radically reorient their religious vision. The hour was thus increasingly deferred into the distant future, and in less than a century, Islam swiftly transformed itself from a religion expecting the end of the world to a religion that aimed to rule the world. In the course of such a profound transition, one would imagine that more than just the eschatological timetable was revised. And as the fourth chapter demonstrates, there were related changes in the nature of the early Islamic community's confessional boundaries and the location of its sacred geography. This is good. Now we're getting to the fun stuff that I really like. This is good, but it's all worthy of building up to, right? I got to get Stephen Shoemaker on. And by the way, just so everybody knows, I live in Washington State now. I'm not too far from where he is located. I hope that I can put together some stuff and go and do some high quality educational scholarship recordings with him for you. And then of course, so that people can see, what's going on. I must say, like, if I had to say, everybody read this book, not many people are going to read it, like in comparison to those who will watch a video. So at least I can get some of this education in through MP4, MP3. People can watch it and learn and not have to read a bunch of paper with ink. I know that, I wish everybody did, but not everybody can and not everybody will. And so it's like, all right, I'm going to do my best to get you all of that good stuff that's really, for some people, it's boring, right? And try to chew it up and make it entertaining and exciting. And sometimes you have to bring in the the polemics in order to get people engaged. And that's the thing about YouTube, right? I could title a video, earliest academic research pertaining to historical Jesus studies. Cool. Or I could say the real origins of Jesus. Did he rise? Oh, yeah, of course he rose. Now you got Christians wanting to see it. Now you got non-Christians who are going, yeah, he didn't rise. And you get people in the chat who come without the interest of really academic stuff, and they're going to pick up academic stuff. And it grabs their attention because it's really going to be talking about these issues. But how do you get everybody to get into the stuff that's hiding behind serious scholarship here and make it mainstream? I'm trying the best I can. Give me some benefit of the doubt. Okay. The final chapter looks first at the seemingly non-sectarian nature of the early Islamic community. Numerous signs point to the existence of a primitive, interconfessional community of the believers that welcomed Jews and apparently even Christians to full membership, so long as they subscribed to a simple profession of faith in God and the last day. Muhammad does not appear to have been understood at this stage as a prophet of unique stature, but was viewed instead as an eschatological herald who had been sent to warn the descendants of Abraham before the final judgment of the hour. This is spicy. Unsurprisingly, the eschatological hopes of these early believers looked to Jerusalem and Palestine, the promised land of their common inheritance, as the sacred landscape within which God would soon realize the climax of history. Although Muhammad's religious movement may perhaps have originated somewhere in the Hijaz, it seems clear that the western coast of Arabia was not originally its holy land. Jerusalem, and not Mecca and Medina, appears to have stood at the center of early Islam's sacred map, which is only to be expected if Islam began, as seems likely, as an eschatological faith grounded in a shared Abrahamic identity. Only as Islam progressively transformed over the course of the 7th century from an inter-confessional Abrahamic eschatological movement into the distinctly Arab faith of an empire defined by Muhammad's unique prophetic message did its sacred geography change accordingly. During this period, the Hijazi cities of Mecca and Medina gradually emerged at the center of a new sacred geography, more suited to the sectarian Arabian faith of classical Islam. This struggle to redefine the Islamic Holy Land reached its climax in the events of the Second Civil War, a conflict that seems to have been partly grounded in competing ideas of sacred geography and whose outcome appears to have largely settled the matter in favor of the Hijaz. These changing circumstances can persuasively explain the existence of an early tradition of Muhammad's leadership during his followers' invasion of Palestine, as well as its eventual replacement. One would expect that a religious movement driven by an urgent eschatology focused on Jerusalem, which earliest Islam appears to have been, would have originally wanted to remember its founding prophet as leading the faithful into the promised land to meet the final judgment. Even if Muhammad never actually made it to the Holy Land, one can well imagine that his early followers would have come to remember their early history as such. Yet once the focus of Islamic devotion turned to Mecca and Medina, a new memory of Muhammad's quietus would be required. Quietus, Quietus, would be required. One that joined the fulfillment of his career to the newly consecrated landscape of the Hijaz. Just such an account one finds in the canonical Islamic narratives of Muhammad's death. The similarity of this hypothesis to the solution proposed by the authors of Hagarism certainly should not be missed, as the eschatological hopes of the early believer went unfulfilled. Jerusalem and the Holy Land lost much of their significance, eventually to be replaced by the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. Consequently, Crone and Cook conclude that the prophet was disengaged from the original Palestinian venture by a chronological revision whereby he died 2 years before the invasion began. While certain other facets of Hagarism's reconstruction of Islamic origins may now seem somewhat dubious, such as its proposal concerning an early Islamic messianism, the identification of earliest Islam as an eschatological movement focused on Jerusalem as the Holy Land remains persuasive and has been validated by much subsequent research. As this study argues, the reports indicated Muhammad's leadership during the Near Eastern conquest, first identified by Hagarism, most likely reflected an early Islamic tradition that was eventually abandoned. The information is attested by a wide range of high-quality sources, and the tradition's early acceptance as well as its eventual rejection both comport with the certain major changes in the development of primitive Islam. Finally, while some scholars of Islam might protest that such an approach merely perpetrates the sins of earlier Orientalist scholarship, I would argue that such accusations are neither very helpful nor warranted. To be sure, the manner in which we choose to represent other cultures, and particularly those cultures that have been victims of Western colonization and aggression, demands serious and constant reflection. Out of such concerns, many scholars from both the Islamic world and the West have proposed that the academic study of Islam must accordingly respect Islamic truth claims regarding Islam's most authoritative traditions, the Quran, and the Sunnah, and refrain from subjecting them to historical criticism. To do otherwise, some would maintain, is to commit what essentially amounts to an act of intellectual colonialism. Although I deeply sympathize with the concerns that give rise to this position, it simply does not present an adequate solution in my view, at least not from the vantage of the academic discipline of religious studies, insofar as the approach taken in this study merely applies methods and perspectives of analysis to formative Islam, and that that have now for well over a century been utilized in the study of Jewish and Christian origins, one must recognize just how othering it is to insist that Islam, and it alone, should be shielded from similar study. One thereby runs the risk of presenting the Islamic tradition in comparison as something fragile and pristine, whose unique perspective is somehow harmed by the application of modern criticism. Thus, while the broader political context identified by Edward Said as well as many others certainly cannot be simply ignored, I would argue that it is at the same time essential for both intellectual and pedagogical reasons to conduct investigations into the earliest history of Islam, as Chase Robinson recommends, committed to the idea that the history made by Muslims is comparable to that made by non-Muslims. This is the introduction to the a prophet has appeared coming with the Saracens, or at least right before you get to that chapter. So here is the next chapter. I just read the whole dang introduction. If you've stuck with me this long, now I'm going to focus on talking to the audience. But I wanted to read this and say, wow, there is a lot here that we need to investigate. I think that we should really look into on the origins of Islam and how this all happened, whether it be textual analysis, mimesis, historical criticism, you name it. I want to investigate these things like I do Christianity, like I do biblical studies and such. So if you haven't fell asleep, I'm shocked. You must have had a killer cup of coffee. But you literally sat through the entire introduction to The Death of a Prophet by Stephen J. Shoemaker. There are many other sources that I didn't link in the description of this video that I really, hope that people will read, like Robert G. Hoyland's Arabia and the Arabs. Highly recommend this book. And get into scholarship. Be cautious what you hear online. If it isn't coming from an academic source, I'd be very cautious, especially when there's axes to grind, right? Like, that doesn't mean they're not accurate. Then it may not be onto stuff, but I'm very careful if they aren't academic, especially in there. So when it comes to Islam and stuff like that, I'm all about it, because I have had people who say, like the accusations of being Islamophobe or this and that. And it's like, they're sensitive. There's a lot of sensitivity around this particular topic. And I want to get to the truth. Anyway, Ryan Druff says, Derek is trying to bankrupt me with all these book recommendations. I am. I'm trying to rob you all blind of all these books. No, I'm just trying to get you up to speed with what I'm reading and what I'm up to. Some people enjoy vicariously living through my studies as they study, and they may see things I don't, but trying to educate, right? Let's learn about this stuff. There's a book that I also put in the description. It's not an academic book, but it was really fun to read. It's called After the Prophet by Leslie Hazleton. Now, she takes the Islamic sources and paints a picture. Let me tease you with a... Let's get
Recorded by arrangement with Anchor Books, an imprint of the Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group, a division of Penguin.
I listened to this a while back, and it was a really good book. Kind of paints you a good picture coming from Islamic sources on how they see the story, the life of Muhammad. After the Prophet, and then she also has... I need my glasses. Harder on my phone to see this stuff. After the Prophet, The First Muslim by Leslie Hazleton. It's on Audible for those who are interested. You can get these books on Audible if you really want to, take a little bit of a dive and get into it. It's fun. Appreciate it. Someone said, good book. Great book. Thank you, Omar. Appreciate the compliment. I thought it was great. I had a blast. I enjoyed that book as well. And you can at least get the perspective, right, from Muslims when you listen to their side. And I think it's important to know both sides, not just one side. That's another thing. Metalhead said, I have that book. Well, that's awesome. I hope more people who can afford it will. Do you have any questions for me? Anybody in the chat, feel free to throw something at me. Right now, I am planning a show with Robert Hoyland later this month. We're going to be planning that, getting that together, me and the Ghost of MythVision. And then also, I have James Howard. Let me pull up the YouTube video that I did with him. Oops. Let's see what I got. James Howard Johnson. He's like a world-renowned historian. And he said at the end of our last interview, there was something in the Quran that was right in front of all of our eyes. And he said he thinks he's figured something out that hasn't been really discussed about Islam, or at least the Quran. And so I said, well, dude, we need to do an episode on the Quran. Let's do it. And so he's going to be doing that and presenting that here on MythVision. I'm looking forward to it. All right, let's see what we got here. MythVision, thoughts on the stolen fable of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Yeah, so the way that was worded, right, it's stolen. And I think that the reason, let me just paint a picture for everybody in the audience, and also if there's ever an academic who sees this interview. Academics don't like to use plagiarize or stolen or things like that. The reason that term gets used, in case you're an academic watching, while I know you disagree with that term, is when you are engaging online with fundamentalist apologists who are 100% convinced that there is no genetic or even a relationship to the story of them sleeping in the caves, coming out in the world is Muslim, versus they go sleep in the caves and they come out in the world as Christian. Like, as academics, they just take that for granted and they see it. And they're like, yeah, I mean, these traditions are being passed around and are in the world. So these are up for grabs. They wouldn't want to use the term stolen because they'd go, I mean, it's anyone's property. This is tradition. This comes from the Abrahamic traditions and any other tradition you might have. Like, so what? It comes from the world around them. They don't see it as stealing. But when you've created a form of your religion that is 100% comes directly from God, they didn't get these sources from anywhere else. The Quran is directly like it came from God to the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. He didn't learn these from Jews or Christians, nothing. That is where people who are in engagement with Muslims on this point go, no, they took this from the world around. So they'll use the words like, you can see, stolen fable. It's 100% like in my world approaching this, that they got this story from the world in which they lived. And the Christians already had this story. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were stories that go further back and further back that the Christians get their ideas from. It wouldn't shock me one bit. So I want to emphasize that so that the perception is understood from both academics and from people who aren't. The reason academics don't call it stolen is because technically it's not stolen. It's not ripped off. It's not technically what we would say plagiarism, because it's up for grabs in the ancient world. But if you were in college and you wrote hey, everybody in the class, write a creation story of your own, and we got the biblical account, and then we got the Epic of Gilgamesh or whatever, your professor's going to say, you guys are talking, something's going on. Either you're copying something from the paper and then creating your own stuff, or, you guys are hanging out after school talking about your creation myths together, and you've come up with this one. So, like, this is why we have this discussion. Yeah, I think it's an important issue. And in Sean Anthony's book on historical Muhammad, like the rise of the empire, I think it's important you read there because he goes into the tradition. He argues there's no genetic connection, meaning like literally verbatim lifted, but the tradition may have been floating orally somewhere and they picked up on this tradition, or it may have been in a different form. We just don't have that Here is the actual manuscript the Quran is using. Whereas we do know or have a better hunch on the idea of dual carnine with the two-horned, leader that is Alexander the Great. And we know that we have good reasons to know where this is coming out of. And I've interviewed an academic on that on the channel. Recommend it. Check it out. Go into MythVision's playlist, and I've got one on the Quran, and I've got one about Islam. Avaros, I appreciate you with the super chat again. I recommend Dan Gibson on Islam's origins in Petra. It'd make for a good conversation. I know that. Most of the academics I talk to, most of them are like, no, Petra doesn't seem the most probable. I've had some people say the origins are Jerusalem. As you hear in Shoemaker's view, he thinks it could have been taking place down here in the Hijazi. And then, of course, imports itself up towards the Jerusalem, towards Palestine. I would love to have, more talks with all of these different people about different ideas, but I want to get the scholars to see what they have to say about some of the stuff too, if I can. Humanist Reformation. Thank you for the super chat. Wow. Big 20 there. So Islam gets its prophecy wrong too, just like Christianity. Looking forward to the scholarship on this. Me too. Nothing says you're in a wrong religion like failed prophecy. Real gods can't ever seem to get their prophecy right. Interesting. I'm going to investigate this deeper, and I'm going to look at any of the sources that show early apocalyptic, eschatological fervor. We've already talked about some in previous episodes about one of the surahs, I believe it is, that they ask like, how soon, how close is the end? And he says the crack or the space between my fingers is how soon the end is. I'm not putting any space. You couldn't fit a piece of paper through my finger right now. And it's the idea like that he's holding two fingers, kind of like we see in art of Jesus, right? Where he has two fingers he holds up and stuff. I don't know if that is totally me just making a leap. I don't know if that art has any significance to the nearness apocalyptic idea with Jesus holding up the two fingers and saying, hey, that's how soon. I don't think it does. I'm just saying that comes to mind. But yeah, he's like, it's that close. It's about to happen. And for me, when I was a Christian, I followed eschatology that led me to a point where there was a problem. Jesus said things that Christians did not accept. And I was like, yo, what is going on? Are you going to believe Jesus? Or are you going to believe these pastors and preachers and whatnot? Which I got excommunicated because I stopped attending the PCA church after 5 elders ended up ridiculing me and like trying to reprove me about my eschatology. So I'm curious to know what Islam has and what is going on with the empires around the origins of Islam, around the time of Muhammad. Are they apocalyptic? Are they eschatological? That's another study I think is important, including into this discussion, because if they are, well, here we are again, right? Talk to a fundamentalist Christian, there's not really any impact. It's this little bubble of Christianity that just comes up out of nowhere. You need to listen to their tradition about how it happened and what really took place. Or we're looking at Rome with competing sons of gods, emperors that are being called sons of gods that are called sons of gods, Hercules, and you name it, right? Asclepius, you name it. The list goes on. And Jesus is in a world competing with other deities. Would that make sense for why they call him a son of God? And he has an ascension narrative in Acts, which is like other ascension narratives with Romulus, you name it. What's going on? We need to know the context. We need to know the world around. Humanist Reformation, I really appreciate that super chat. You keeping the lights on here and showing love. Inquisitive mind in the house. What is Alexander the Great doing in the Quran, especially when his fingerprints are... Did I miss you? Alexander the Great's fingerprints are in the Quran, the 2 horns building a dam to keep out Gog and Magog and going to the place of the rising sun. Exactly. I definitely am into this, though. I love learning about that stuff, but I could see why this would be a scary place for someone who's a fundamentalist, you know, figuring out where this really comes from, how it all starts, blah, 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 you know. Doc Thoromanot, prophets all suffer from disability of understanding this might not age well. That's true. They say there's like a 100% track record with apocalypticists. People who make the claim the end is nigh and it doesn't happen. Absolutely. Any other comments, super chats, anything like that before I let you all go? And I'm going to go eat me a meal. And just keep in mind, the end is this near, the space between my fingers, you know. Invite Dr. Ali Attai. I think hasn't he been on blogging theology? I think he's been on blogging theology. Yeah, I think he might be someone I've already been interested in having come on. But yeah, I need to look at what subject matter I'd want to have him on for in specifics. Okay, sorry, I was tripping over a wire. Anybody? No more questions, no more comments? I don't know who Israel Anderson is, Macy. Maybe you can email me. Let me know who they are, and I'm interested in looking them up. Does any scholar use stemmatics and stichometry to trace the Quran back to Muhammad? I don't know. I know that linguistically, and then looking at like the lower palimpsest manuscripts and stuff like that, they see a form of an early Quran that, I mean, they date a lot of this stuff to the mid 7th century. Like they think definitely from Umar. Most of the scholars I've talked to, I don't think Stephen J. Shoemaker follows that position, but I haven't read his new book on the beginning of the Quran or the creation of the Quran. I think most of them would say that for sure the Quran goes at least back to Umar, and there's good reason to think that the tradition in some sense in the Quran may go back to Muhammad, or at least some of it for sure. But yeah, I think even critical scholars suggest that. Friendly ex-Muslim again would be cool. I talked to him this morning actually and messaged him. So, and I hope he's doing well. We haven't really talked much, but I need to email Peter von Siever again and find out. Baybars, I appreciate the reminder. Peter von Sievers. Yeah. Omar says he can't be Alexander the Great. Laugh out loud. This is a funny argument that has no evidence behind it. As far as we know, he was a pagan. Well, I'd love to get Leslie Hazleton on. But as far as your comment here, let me do this here. Find the Dual Qarnayn interview that I did for anybody who's really interested in seeing what the evidence is on this subject matter. I'm going to copy and paste this in the chat for anybody who's serious so that you can actually see it. But I did a interview with Tommaso Tessi, or Tessi, if that's how you properly pronounce it. And I'm going to share my screen just to show you the academic that I did that with. Here we go. So this is the scholar that I did it with. If anybody wants to dive deeper, I absolutely recommend you see what he has to say, because he 100% is convinced, and the earliest Islamic voices say it was Alexander the Great. That doesn't mean there weren't later voices trying to change that, but this is a Islamic scholar, and he finds outside non-Muslim sources that are saying the very same types of things. So if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, the only reason you wouldn't want to say it's a duck is because you don't want it to have influence on the Quran, in my opinion. I would love to have Leslie Hazleton join me. Pope Francis. You know, Ray, look, he's emailed me. He's just constantly emailing me. And I'm like, dude, I'm not interested. You're just the Pope, And he still email me, and I have everything just go straight to spam. But maybe for you, Ray, maybe I'll consider the Pope. I'll consider it. I don't really want to. He's not that big of a figure. You know what I mean? But we'll see. It's late over there in London. Skept Islamica, cool guy, and his content is fantastic. I'm unfortunately not family with Islamic history, though, or familiar with goes over my head. Worth investigating, just so you understand where it comes from. YouTube automatically deletes comments when you try to link any links in the comment section. It's just how it is. Why can't religious scholars agree on where Jesus or Muhammad are buried or where they died? Well, as far as Muhammad goes, I don't know if he did, if their tradition grants where he actually died. He had this ascension, right? And it supposedly happens in Jerusalem, right? At the Temple Mount. And as far as Jesus goes, I mean, this is a problem. When I asked this of Robin Faith Walsh about Jesus, she said they can't even figure that out. Even in the 2nd century, they're already scratching their heads wondering, like, where was it? Where is this empty tomb that Jesus was at? So you got to wonder, is the empty tomb legend? And if it is, what happened to Jesus? What actually happened to him? We don't really know. Paul says that he died, was buried, rose again. Buried where? Buried what? What do you mean? And he rose again. So a lot of times there are little tombs, maybe not so significant in the earliest community, that they end up making, oh, this is the one. Later on, the Christian church ends up saying, this is where he was buried. This is where he was born. This is where he ascended, yada, yada, yada. So I don't think the religious side, and it depends on who we're talking to, would agree with the critical scholar side on these issues as well. And it depends on what tradition. Are you Catholic? Well, come on over here. We got the Catholic side. Are you a Lutheran? So Omar thinks it's ridiculous to think that dual chronine is. If the author was thinking, like you're thinking, that this Alexander the Great is just as pure on pagan and stuff, maybe. But if you read in Josephus, a Jew, monotheist, believes in one God, he says that Alexander the Great paid a visit to Jerusalem, found these supposed texts that were writing of his predictions in Daniel, because Daniel is dealing with the Greek kingdom. And in this literature, he somehow honors the God of Israel. Is this continued tradition of Alexander the Great within the Alexander romances and whatnot being passed on within Jewish and Christian communities and found its way into the Quran? Not implausible. In fact, it's very probable, especially when it looks very similar to the other stuff that is written about Alexander romance and whatnot. What about the Dalai Lama? Dalai Lama. Look, I've been ignoring him too. I'm sick of it. If he won't slap the mosquitoes that are biting him because he doesn't want to take a life of any creature, I'm just sorry. I don't know if I want to slap the keyboard to open his emails. Appreciate you tuning in, Dalai Lama. Thanks. I'd love to check it out. Yeah, check out that interview. I linked it. When you get a chance with Tahudi's videos on Sonnetter TV, he literally shows you where Moses comes from. What, Egypt? I mean, the stories kind of put him there, but Derek, hope your son had a great birthday. Thanks for all you're doing. Thank you, Wayne. He did have a good birthday, and we got a whole family get together. We went and ate at a Mexican restaurant and spent some family time, got him some presents and stuff. So really appreciate the compliment and thinking about my family. If it is honestly, it wouldn't make a difference. It just means I was corrected, and I'm happy to be. Thanks for all your videos. Oh, Dalai Lama in the house with a big old 20. Late to the live stream. Pine Creek Politics had my attention, showing love and support. Thank you, Dalai Lama. I really appreciate the love and support. And yeah, you might want to tune back, and if you can endure me reading an entire introduction to a book, The Death of a Prophet and the Rise of Islam, and it goes into that, why this study is necessary, you might want to tune back. If you don't, Play it at 2 times speed or something. I don't know. Really appreciate the 20. Thank you for the support. Seriously. Hats off to Pope Francis. He's the only pope that has got down on his knees to wash poor people's feet. Interesting. When you get a chance. Okay, yeah, you already commented that. Feel free to email me if you want. I'm just connecting with you guys. Someone said I'm yapping. Grays174, have you happened to read any of the Christians who are cool with the late date for Daniel and how that works with their doctrine of inspiration? Most critical scholars recognize this. I mean, I'm confused. I don't understand it. But I've never just asked them, okay, if this is late, how does this factor into your faith and all this? Never really dove into asking them that question. But Grays, I really appreciate it. I'm not going to lie. I'm dying of starvation here. I need to get some food in me before I end up passing out. I really appreciate you. Hit the like button, share it out. Let's dive in, and I'll try and make it less exhausting of listening to me reading stuff and try to package stuff in a more fun way whenever I actually do produce the content, or have the scholar on themselves, because then they could just explain it. So I really appreciate you in the chat and tuning in. Someone said, Derek, I think you exaggerate Muhammad as an apocalyptic prophet, like how Jesus is depicted in the Bible. Yet, yes, the prophet is the last prophet, but we are taught not to desire to live in the end of times. I think you may have missed what I was reading there. So this is actually scholarship, not my thoughts, even though it is interesting that we find apocalyptic fervor there. But yeah, I'm going to explore this further in the book, and I hope that more people do, because that's where we'll be able to hear non-Muslim sources say what they say and early Muslim sources say what they say. Draw your own conclusion. And then Blake says, man cannot live on bread alone. Well, I'm about to go live on some bread. Derek is the last prophet, Dalai Lama. You weren't supposed to tell our secret. Omar, thank you. Have a great evening, Derek. Take care, and take care, everyone. It was fun talking to you all. Bye. Be safe. Be safe. You too, my friend. I hope you tune in on the future episodes. Ladies and gentlemen, please check us out in the description. I got a lot of videos that I've done on the Patreon. You can join as little as $3 a month, and you will access all videos that I launch. And of course, there are other options as well. You can always read the tiers, help support our work, and let's explore Islam together. What do you say? Never forget, we are MythVision.